Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Still Loading podcast. Today I'm joined by Ben Norton, but I didn't even pronounce that right. Ben Norton, who's joined us to talk about his leadership development experiences. He's got about too many years, right? It gets to that point where you're like, I've got 20 plus years experience.
Yeah.
But there is like that sort of level of experience. And Ben has had a great, amazing career in SaaS, in technology, in software. And I think he has got amazing insights into kind of the things that we need to think about in terms of leadership for the digital age, which is why he's a great guest for this podcast. Ben, could you please give the audience a bit more detail about you and what you're up to?
Hello, Ben Norton.
That was just me getting stuck in my own throat. Sorry about that. But Norton.
That's quite an intro. It is that time of career where you suddenly start counting and everything seems to be at least 20. And that's quite a lot. And yes, also true is that I've spent the last 7, nearly 8 years in a SaaS environment, so Salesforce, Marketing Cloud, and then into Emarsys, which was then consumed by SAP. But prior to that, I'd done some work in sort of professional services consulting agency stuff, and I've always been the services guy within either a services environment or the services guy within a software environment. So up until relatively recently, I always felt a little bit like the alien. So when I was in an agency environment, they would think I was the software guy. And then when I was in the software environment, they were like, you're the agency guy. So I felt homeless. And it was only really when the MarTech stuff really started to kick off, which is probably at least 10 years ago now, that I suddenly felt like I'd arrived, and I had some value to add because I was able to see what consumer-facing brands were doing from a kind of marketing and advertising perspective, but also able to see how software companies were trying to automate some of that stuff and how they were trying to sell into a similar persona as agencies were trying to sell into. I mean, not the same one. So my journey's been it's been in step with the evolution of marketing technology, which has now sort of become, I think, CX. Obviously, what's true about software is that it's very good at reinventing itself and constantly slightly baffling the market. And that's, and it's important that you're always slightly dazed and confused because it helps us.
And I think
it helps us to sell.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great, observation and reflection on your part to realise that actually that ability to almost navigate the two worlds and translate for them has given you this insight into kind of the emerging trend that's happened with MarTech. Was there ever a point at which you yourself were lost in translation?
That's a good question. There's probably been multiple times where I've been lost in translation. I feel like probably the most out of place I felt was when I first got to Salesforce, and that was more to do with the size of the organization. So I'd worked into large software companies before, IBM and Adobe, but I'd never been on the payroll. So I definitely felt it at that point. I was sort of headhunted in and put into a role, and I felt completely out of my depth. And I think for the first 3 months or so was just scrambling to stay alive. And I was asked to run a team of people who each one could have done the job I was being asked to do. And initially that I found that incredibly intimidating because you're in this kind of egoic struggle to prove your worth. You're the new guy in. Plus I had, I think, one person in that team who had applied for the role that I hired in for. So it was a perfect storm. Plus I'd gone into a large company then called Exact Target, which was just completing its integration as an acquisition. So it was a really, I mean, I look back now and as I'm explaining it to you, I think, God, no wonder I felt a little bit lost. But yeah, it was like stepping onto a speeding train. It took me at least 6 months to get my bearings. To some degree, I felt like I never really got them. But the business itself, the way it was built from the ground up by Mark Benioff, is such an impressive large enterprise that, you know, I don't think anybody, as far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone does it better than that. It has all of the inherent issues of a monster business, but it's probably one of the cleanest versions of. But yeah, definitely there. I felt that for at least 6 months, the language I was talking, even the slides I was presenting, felt fluffy. You know, so I was doing strategic slides, and it wasn't until I found a couple of people who were ex-strategic planners, actually, who had got jobs as kind of, what were they called back then? BizCons, business consultants. I found those guys, and they were out pitching consumer brands, and I suddenly thought, oh, thank God. And I sort of clung to them through the storm for a couple of months. And then I found my feet. So yeah, I think that was definitely the biggest step change. But I've always gone into roles where I haven't felt comfortable on purpose, because I think that I love the learning curve. I genuinely do. I like the incline. I like the challenge is a bit generic, but I like to feel a little bit, oh God, you know.
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, going to like such a monster like that is quite an interesting transition, but also I think it's really interesting because I think you pick up on culture, right? And I was talking to a contact of mine today, and we were talking about culture in terms of the remote world and the remote cultures that exist now. And myself, I was reading, I mean, it's a very old quote, I know this, but the quote was, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And of late, that's what I keep seeing with my clients working with scale-ups and predominantly remote first organizations, is they're struggling a bit to almost create and manifest their cultures, because you have to be so much more intentional with your design and with your instructions to your people. But also, how do you create a really effective remote culture when you don't see each other and you can't build those bonds? And it's an interesting sort of thing to think about. But when you had that role, you must have been in the office. How do you think you would have approached it if you were just remote, or maybe you were remote and that was part of the journey?
No, it wasn't. I was not remote. I was in the office. I mean, that was part of the trauma, was going into Salesforce. You know, like 40 floors up, you know, in a turbo lift, you know, into the Ahana based, you know, every office looking the same with the same wood from Hawaii, and you know, that was part of it. I honestly don't know. I have no idea how I could have done it remotely. And I look at it now and think for the third jobbers, which I still occasionally get involved in interviewing people who are third jobbers, as I would describe them. So probably late 20s, mid-late 20s. They don't have the same sense of needing to prove themselves within a business. They tend to flip it and think the business needs to prove itself to them. And I think that, which is completely the opposite of me, certainly, where it was just, you know, work. Oh, sorry, something's just popped up. Let me get rid of this. But I think when you already had that, so you've already got that age group coming into a business, spending a couple of years and then saying, I don't feel that it's giving me what I want, and not going for a progressive move in the sense of more money or more responsibility, just going somewhere else, which for me, looking at, you'd be like, what's that about? Like, how is that progressive? But then if you add in the remote aspect to that, you've got even less of a connection to those people, and they are the engine room of the business. They're the ones that you're hoping at least 20% of them are going to stay for 5, 10 years and drive your next leadership team, right? So how the hell are you going to keep them when their outlook is already, what are you going to do for me? Right? Not what can I do for you as much. I don't mean that's as self-centered as it just did, but comparatively it's more about what can you do for me. And then on top of that, the company has no way to communicate its value back to them. There's no office, there's no drinks after work, there's no activities after work, there's no social, there's no chit chat, you're not making friends, right? So it's that, so you're not connecting with a leader who you maybe have got no organizational overlap with, who you see and have coffee with and you learn. And I don't know how organizational dynamics can work in that sense. And I've definitely seen it as COVID hit. The business I was in, Amarsis, was an incredibly cohesive business driving towards a really clear objective, acquisition, and was kept right on track the whole time. And then it just dissipated. It was gone almost overnight. So yeah, I think it's really tough for companies to do that. I think there's a lot of quite worthy but ultimately slightly crap ways in which companies are trying to do it. Because I think it's hard, and I don't think anything really matches the physical. Like you got to go and actually talk to people. I come from a commercial background, so there would always be sales kickoffs, where you'd all get together somewhere. Even those have been virtual, and that would be the place where you'd go and you'd party, but you'd also meet all of your colleagues from across the world. They were amazing events, very draining, but also fantastic. Not anymore, and they're just coming back on stream. So yeah, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I think it's sad, and I don't know how we bring it back without it feeling like it's enforcement. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's interesting as the kind of challenge, I think, for the next few years for companies. I mean, culture is always the secret sauce of any organization. That's what differentiates you ultimately from the competition. So I think those companies who can think about how to invest in remote culture or hybrid working culture in a meaningful way, where you, as you said, it doesn't feel forced and arbitrary, and nobody on earth likes forced fun. Enforced fun is like it's like an oxymoron beyond oxymorons. It's just like I'm always that person in the back being like, "Kill me, take me somewhere right now."
You're right and you're wrong, because it's very cultural. So we Brits are probably the least
fun.
The least compliant and the most cynical, hard bitten. Our American cousins are slightly more willing to take that leap, and certainly, I mean, you can't really generalize about APAC; it's so diverse. But certainly, the offices we had, Hong Kong, Sydney, they didn't feel quite so awkward about it. I think one of the ways in which I've managed to keep the team that I ran up until fairly recently, one of the sort of areas of interest / passion that I have is giving people, and I did it when we weren't remote working, but I think it's become even more important since we have been, is giving people the scope to not just do what the company is asking them to do. So one of the key drivers of people having job satisfaction, so the data, having a boss that isn't a nightmare, he's choosing his words carefully, right? Having the boss who isn't a nightmare,
Keep it clean.
Yeah, absolutely, and feeling like you are in some way connected to either the purpose, to your point, the culture, but feeling like you've got your hand on a lever, that you're not just taking care of one small section of a long anonymous workflow. And I think one of the ways in which I've tried to do that from a customer facing or a prospect facing perspective, selling consultancy or delivering insight or selling, is allowing people to bring some of their own, bring some of themselves to the value proposition or the work they're being asked to do. So not being so rigid in terms of saying, okay, you have to have this style guide, you've got to do these slides, you must talk about the 19 offices across the world first, giving people that leeway to say, hey, listen, get these 3 things, try not to get them wrong, but the rest, I'm more concerned with how you connect with someone than what you say. So it's that kind of, that's helped by giving people a sense of authenticity, if you want. But equally, you've got to balance that, because to another individual, that leeway of sort of go and like have a bit more freedom can be terrifying, because they're actually saying, give me the 25 slides, or give me the workflow, let me look at the Confluence page, and I'll just do it by the numbers. So it's very much about personality. But I have seen that work very well, is where people are given latitude. And I don't think businesses are very good at that. They tend to either fall into the classic agency mold of like, oh, hi, Elena. Oh, you're starting today. Here's your laptop. All the best. Or it's 6 weeks of onboarding, a cap, a water bottle, oh, please post this on LinkedIn. It's one or the other. And I think, somewhere in the middle is about right. It's that point at which you take the training wheels off and say, go and actually do something that only you could do, rather than this sort of quite homogenous thing. So I think for me, that's been a winner. I've kept some talented people longer than I thought I would, not because of the company, but because of the environment in which we're working, where you're thinking, they're not going to stay. Because, how can they, when they're not getting any of that interaction and progression that you get from being in the same physical space?
Yeah, you raised some interesting reflections for me, because I think for people to be able to put their own mark on something, it would get more, they're more engaged and they've got more buy-in with what they're doing if they've got their own flavour to it. It's just like if you...
Yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of what it is, I think.
Yeah, and it's equally, if you think about, I'm sure both of us have sat on the other side of the table being presented to, whether that be in a kind of commercial environment or an internal environment, whatever it is, we've all sat and been PowerPointed at some point, right? And the more authentic and connected that person is to what it is they're presenting to you, the more connected you are to them. It's as simple as that. The topic can be dry, but if they're clearly invested in it and they've built it, rather than saying, oh, this is slide 3, oh yeah, leverage competitive advantage, and that's not just about not boring people, that's also about the presenter feeling like they're doing a job that only they could do. And that drives the retention piece, I think. I know, because I've seen it happen. So by giving people latitude, you keep them. By giving people latitude in a controlled way, you also have more effective meetings. And by having more effective meetings, commercial or otherwise, you get to better actions. So I just think a lot of companies lack the framework and or courage to do it. So they're either hugely formulaic, go and do this, or they are just, do your best.
Get on with it, yeah, chaos. No, and also if it's like do it yourself all the time, that just takes time. Everyone doing their own version, like you almost need an 80%, right? So you've got almost like a template that people can use, but then they make it into their own style or presentation or whatever. And also it just gives people, as you said, the chance to radiate their authenticity. And authenticity is one of those words around leadership that kind of comes up. And it's interesting to kind of unpick what that actually means and how to be authentic. because it's a word. I'm pretty sure it's in every leadership book I've ever read, or at
Yeah.
least the last 10 years, right? But I'm sure before like in the 50s, it was probably like command and control, be a complete dictator. But now it's all about being authentic. But it's different. I think it's difficult for people to understand what that means.
I I think it comes back to the point about what not people, but what the most important um, section of people at work, i.e. that kind of 23 up to 30 something, that's the future of your business there.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a corporate environment anyway, right? And most other businesses, I would imagine, that's your future there. And for those people, that they this idea of authenticity, they are in a world where there's not so much of a traditional society. They probably don't know their neighbours.
Mm-hmm.
They are maybe they are religious in an organised way, or maybe they're not. Right? And so
On average.
what you have is this kind of quite dispersed world outside, and the expectations of work are so much higher. So some of the conversations I've had have been, I mean, on a human level, completely understandable. But then when you come away and you finish that conversation and you reflect on it and you think, wow, like to expect that from a company, it is that's it's okay, it's fine, but it's trying to be church and state and it's like it's not just salary anymore, you know, and that's very challenging. So that idea of being authentic, yeah, okay, fine. As a leader, you've got to be authentic. What does that mean? Does it mean that occasionally I might swear, or what does that mean exactly? Plus, I've got to pick my way through that environment where people have they're putting the business on a much higher pedestal. You must achieve these things. You must be morally, ethically, all these things must be right. You must be all about equality. You can't put a foot wrong here. You must be inclusive. That is completely legitimate and understandable. But then to say to leaders, and can you be authentic within this environment, please? It's kind of like that scene out of Kung Fu Panda where they go into the training hall and it's all like swinging fire sticks, and like it's incredibly difficult to achieve it because you're being authentic within an incredibly complex environment. And for me, I mean, I've watched incredibly charismatic leaders, Benioff being a great example. I mean, I saw him in the flesh a few times. Very charismatic, very engaging, but there's the whiff of politician and great orator about them. And you're like, is that authentic? I don't know. But for people that are sort of beyond, like beneath the rarefied air of the C-suite of $1 billion business, it's not so easy. It's hard to be an authentic leader and navigate all of this. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I think it's flatter leadership. I think that's what I've learned is it's less hierarchical. You must be flatter because that kind of gets you're not on such a high wire if you're flatter in your style. If you're, what you said about command and control and you're super hierarchical, then that's a high wire and you can come off it. Whereas if you flatten both your organization and your style, then it's much easier because you can constantly you can check in and you can compliment where you might be weak on a particular topic by the people that are around you. I mean, that's always been my trick. I think one of my sort of most developed skills is finding people that can help me to look good. And I'd have had some amazing ones over the years where I've just been like, oh, thank God you're there. You know, so yeah, I think authenticity is easy said, harder to do.
I agree with you. And
Yeah.
I suppose it would be great to know and understand, like a leader that inspired you along your own development through the thousands of years that you've been involved in.
Yeah, I mean, there's ones that I've sort of admired from afar, and I often talk about Mark Benioff because I just think the way he baked in, and it's a software reference, but the way he came out of Oracle, he saw everything that was maybe weak about Oracle because it was set up as a software company in a different era. And he saw, first of all, from a quite academic perspective, he saw that software as a service might be a thing, right? So, I mean, that's quite a thing. But on the softer side, he baked in a charitable organisation into the business straight away. He gave them founder shares. He sold his software for nothing to any non-profit. That remains the case today. He's got a multi-million-dollar business there. He put in community work for all of his people from the beginning. There was no sort of hasty, not greenwashing, but you know what I mean, trying to look good. CSR work for, oh shit, we better look like we care, right? He put that in right from the outset. Combined with that, the guy is a consummate, very commercially minded, consummate communicator, sales guy machine. I mean, there's just been a lot of layoffs, which are very unfortunate. Like 8,000 people have gone from Salesforce as they try and control margin. But so definitely admire him, because I think to do that at a business at that scale is impressive. My own managers, I think. Well, I had one very, very early. A woman called Julie Bullen, who was she was my first manager that kind of championed me. I mean, I'm talking like in the dark ages,
There were no internets back then.
no internets back then. I was on a AS400. Yeah. Anyway, but she was great because she saw the potential in me and selflessly backed me. So that was the first time someone looked after me, and she kind of set the mold for the types of leaders that I could work for, because I think I can be quite mercurial and challenging at times. So I've had a lot of really human bosses, and some not so much. But I've had some people who have been very kind. I mean, I know it's not really, you're looking for, sometimes Benioff is the sort of look from afar and say what a great businessman and strategist. But actually the bosses that I've worked with the best are the ones that push me when I need pushing, but are kind. Because life and work can be hard. And it's the ones that form a genuine connection with you and say, do you know what, I'm going to promote you above myself. And I've learned from them that in my leadership style to be, or what is it? I can't remember who said it to me. It was a few jobs ago, but someone said to me, what you should be doing is trying to train at least 2 people in your org to take your job. Like that. If you're doing that, if you've got 2 people in your org that you think, okay, 2 years, I need them to train my job. That's self-serving in a large organization because you can take the next one and have them slot in. But also it just means that you're pouring everything you know into 2 people, and that you're not being guarded or political or Machiavellian. You're just giving all of it. And I've absolutely observed that. So I've seen a lot of very kind, patient, tolerant, and then recently I've seen some leaders, particularly in Amasis, a couple of people there who have been genuinely obsessed with getting better and ask for feedback without gritting their teeth. So they take the feedback and say thanks very much, and you see them doing it. The guy I worked with for a few years, called Grant Coleman, who now has gone on to somewhere else, who I still know very well. I remember with him giving him feedback. We were peers at the time, and I gave him feedback rather nervously about something, and watched him just onboard it and just make it so. So yeah, I think it's the human side of it that really appeals to me. Not so. I understand the need for someone that can create unique value, but i.e. a Jobs or a Benioff, guys like that. but often they're not particularly great humans.
No,
But
no, it was a funny thing I recently realized was a lot of books about CEOs and so forth. You're actually, celebrating people who you wouldn't actually want to work with, or, like if they were on your team, they would be an absolute nightmare. So
yeah,
it's so funny that all these like bestsellers of the behaviors that we're all supposed to be trying to get towards, but equally, it wouldn't necessarily be a great read to read about like Donna, who was just a great manager, who's just super kind and it's like always helping you with whatever you wanted. So it's a funny
yeah.
one. I think leadership, there's the big concept with the capital L from a, theoretical standpoint, and then there's the practical realities of just having someone who cares.
It's for me. It's that you get two types of leaders. There's the humans that are just people who are naturally a leader and would be, whether it be in a factory, on a football pitch, on a netball pitch, wherever it would be, they would naturally gravitate to the top, right? And then there are the ones who are, and that's what I would call a human leader. And she comes from anywhere and will always end up there because people just naturally want them there. And then you've got the visionaries who you absolutely need in a business, because if you don't have someone constantly creating new value, particularly today when it's just innovation everywhere, then you're kind of screwed because you don't have a business to work for. So you need those two qualities. I think it's unreasonable to ask for them to exist in one person. So
Yeah, I agree.
you,
I
yeah,
agree.
yeah,
Because I was reading a brilliant article recently because I'm obviously involved with lots of scale ups, and they spoke about how at a certain point, and I keep seeing this on repeat actually at the moment, that you
yeah,
need the visionary to get you to a certain point, and then you need almost like the caretaker CEO who can help stabilize and professionalize the organization. You needed someone to get it up and running. That kind of, it's not been done before. But then you need someone and it was in relation to the Elon Musk situation, because obviously he's a visionary, but he's gone into an organization like Twitter that already exists and already has been established. So it's causing mayhem, his leadership style, and has done because he's a visionary. So if he joined Twitter at the beginning, he would have been able to make a huge impact, no doubt. But it's just at this point, it's disruptive because it's an established business.
yeah. I mean, I am fascinated by businesses that are at that inflection point. I mean, and I've been lucky
Hmm.
enough to work for three. I mean, Amasis being one of them, although it was very mature in its years when I got there, it was at one of those inflection points. It was trying to make that really big step up to scale. And that's a fascinating area because, like you say, you're going from a business that has a heart and a soul and something about it that makes the customers want to work with them. And then you've got to
Hmm.
turn that heart and a soul into a functioning machine. And that transition is very challenging because you're trying to kindle that culture and keep that visionary there, but also at the same time bring in some grown-ups who could say, hey, like, you can't actually ask people to work at the weekends. If they'd like to, then that's great, but but
Yeah.
and that kind of, I love that moment of inflection where you've got a business that's got something special and is coming and asking, how do we go to market? Literally, how do we go to market? Because we got something, we're selling it to 3 customers, we'd like to have 300. How do we take this and bifurcate and duplicate and keep it special? How do we set up a bean tin machine that still keeps what we've got? And that's an incredibly edifying business challenge. I mean, you're in it all the time, right? So I think it's that I totally get why businesses at that stage of their life cycle are, I think they're addictive actually. That
Yeah.
type,
It's just, I
really.
think it's because you can really see the impact of a leader on that business. You change it, and the whole thing changes, the whole tone, the whole atmosphere. And like you're saying, it's like, how do you keep that secret sauce but equally professionalized? And it's a very interesting conundrum.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and you can really get your hat. I think the thing that I mean, it's a different challenge. I mean, Emarsys now within SAP is a very different challenge. Same business, a lot of the same people, but there are challenges. It took me about 6 months to really realise what am I now doing. So from a business where you're able to get your hands on the levers, which I think was what we're both talking about. So and you need a certain personality to want to do that, because if you are nervous about, well, what does this do? And as you all sort of plummet down the hillside and you think like, oh no, not that one, right? You need to have the stomach for that, and if and so companies and organisations self-select in a way, because if you're in that, I'm not a fan of people that I like the fact you call it scale up, because I'm not a fan of people saying startup, because I've pitched into a lot of companies that say, well, we've got a startup culture. And you're like, well, you're 5 years old. Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. It means you're dysfunctional and you don't have any processes. That's what that means. We don't want to do the meeting minutes because that's boring.
Yeah, so you've got an autocratic despot that runs it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Well,
essentially.
yeah. But for a minute there in the employment market, startup culture was like a selling point, wasn't it? It was like startup culture. Oh, I'll have some of that. And then suddenly you start getting the stories out about about Tinder and what that startup culture was like. And you're like, oh man, maybe I don't want the startup culture anymore. And now that's begun to shift away from startup culture, which basically means work very hard, to your point, with no tools, no processes, no guide rails, and like no time.
And all for the whim and whimsy of a particular person. Like that's what can happen, because ultimately if the founder is still the CEO at a certain point, they've been able to have their own little kingdom or queendom for as long as they want. And so it depends on the industry as well, and it depends on them. And if they had anybody, as you said, senior challenging them. And it's interesting as well when you start to see the patterns in these companies, when they start doing their senior hires, like just keep an eye out to see how long those senior hires stay. Because then you'll see if they're willing to work with people. Because if there's suddenly like an exit, it's like, oh, I don't think it's working well. I don't think they're relinquishing control.
I think there's a gentleman that we have in common who uses a piece of research. I forget exactly where it comes from, but it's data based. So it's from 20.
We love a bit of data.
And it looks at the primary causes for business failure within year 1 to 5. Mm-hmm. So it goes and tries to quantify that, and it does a pretty good job of quantifying that. So, and I believe, I might be wrong, but I don't think I am, because it was the conversation I only had a couple of days ago, and although I am quite ancient, I think I can reach back that far. The main reason for failure is an autocratic leader. Mm-hmm. So now you can be a visionary leader, to come back to our previous topic, but where people like Jobs, possibly Benioff, don't know enough about the gentleman, were smart, is that they were smart enough to know, I'm good at this, I can be a tyrant, I need 3 people around me that will call me out on my stuff and will stand up to me, and who I will allow to do so, right? Yep. So, and that way you have a buffer between you and the real world, right? And you're still allowed to be that uncompromising visionary that doesn't care, but you've got people around you that say, hey, Steve, we can't do that. Right? But if you've got an autocratic leader who won't even extend to that, then you've got a problem. And so it's a nuggety problem. And I think the second one was something like a weak CFO, like that. So you've autocratic leader, weak CFO. Those were the two things. But it's interesting, because I've seen a business that I've been in businesses that have acquired, they lose their visionary and they lose their secret sauce. because
Yeah.
they stop
Yeah.
innovating.
It's a
And
funny one. It's a funny one.
yeah, yeah. So it is. I do think that leadership thing comes down to you're a human leader. Your example of like who wants to read the book about Donna, who was just the most amazing manager ever, right?
Yeah.
And like, really? Oh, whatever.
But
But
just like
or
she remembered my birthday. She always brought in cake. Like she was just amazing. She pushed you. She coached you. It's great. Or he. But
yeah,
yeah, no, I totally.
not
It
gonna
is
not
interesting.
gonna sell. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting.
With so we've talked a little bit about your experience, kind of your on your own leadership development journey where you joined a company and it was a challenge for you. And we've talked a little bit here around trends as well in the that we both have experienced within that. I
Yeah.
suppose from your experience and knowing a bit about like the trends that are happening, what would your three top tips for leaders be, thinking about leadership for the digital age?
I think I've already touched on them as we've been chatting. I think that for me, 100% is about having at least two people in your business that you feel within 2 years can do your job. I think it's very, very difficult to run a team where there's a huge gap between competencies. It's very difficult. So, and again, scale up startup, there's a lot of that where we're like, okay, we're going to cut our cloth according to our funding, and right. So that would be my biggest one: is two people, 2 years. So make sure two people, 2 years that can do it. The other one is you must finding your authentic voice is going to be the same thing as talking to those two people and saying, how authentic do you think I ought to be? And I was told something really early in my career, which was try not to have too big a gap between Ben outside of work and Ben inside. And one of my good friends growing up was a stockbroker who was completely the opposite of that rule, and used to slick his hair back, put his tagger on, grr, I'm a tiger, and off he'd go to work and be unrecognisable physically, spiritually, emotionally, in order to survive the job he did. So I think there's that the two people over 2 years is huge. The authenticity is part of those two people, but also that idea of if you've got kids, they're a great way of finding out. If you don't, then it's your friends and family and saying, what is it? What is it about me that you like, dislike, think more of, less of, and being less worried about that. I think less worried about what should I bring to work, what should I not bring to work, because I think you're going to be managing people for whom work is so much more than it ever was for us. You're going to want it to be everything from sort of parent to church to healthcare to pastoral care, and it's much more than that. So if you come looking at it like you're an autocratic boss, it's not really going to work. The other one is I think you do need, but my last one, I think that's 3-ish. Yeah. My last one would be you got to have a little bit of, I think you need some shtick. So you need either vision or ways of working in which people can see how you're different. So I'll give an example. I've always used, so I've run teams up to about 90 people ish. That's the biggest it's got, and within that I've probably had 5 direct reports, and with those with those direct reports, I will say to them, there's 3 ways you can talk to me. You can, when we have our one-to-ones, you can just say, okay, I just want to get on the couch, in which case I just want to go bleh and complain and moan and I don't want any response. I just want you to say, oh, Elena, that is rough. That's number one. You can say, I'm going to do that, but I'm asking for feedback and advice. So this happened. How do I deal with her? Can you, what would you do? Type stuff. Or you can ask for direct intervention. So you could say, I'm out of my depth, I've made a mistake, I need you to send an email, or I need you to leverage this relationship and protect me, please. Right? And so that's an example of the sort of leadership shtick, that's not easy to say, that I've used. I've always used that with team members. So something that says, this is the type of person I am, these are the expectations that I have, right? This is how you need to talk to me, because if you don't talk to me like this, you're not going to get the best out of me. And I'm not super structured, but I'm semi-structured. And once people get that and they realise that you are a unique human being, but you're making an effort to integrate with them, then I think it can work. And I've been lucky enough to have like fairly low churn in my teams. I haven't had, touch wood, I haven't had any disasters management-wise or leadership-wise. So far, there's still time.
There's still time. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the conversation. It's been really insightful and interesting and whimsical at best. And I'm glad that you have, you've made some great strides in your career. No doubt you'll continue to do so. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alona. It's been a pleasure.